Scooby-Doo is potentially one of the most popular cartoon series ever created. From its TV origins in the 1969 Scooby-Doo Where Are You?, to animated feature films like the 1998 Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, and even live-action stuff like we saw with the 2002 film simply titled Scooby-Doo. Even more recently than that, there's been a CGI feature film in the form of the 2020 Scoob, so it's safe to say that the series is still going strong. As we all know though, any series as long-running and as popular as Scooby-Doo has to receive video game adaptations. And that is where we come in. Join me throughout October this year for the Scooby-Doo-a-Thon, where we're going to be taking a look at 3 of the Scooby-Doo games released on the PS2. And to kick things off, it only makes sense to start with the first game released on the system, with Scooby-Doo Night of 100 Frights. This game was actually released in 2002, the same year as the live-action Scooby-Doo film, so overall it was a pretty good year for the series. Scooby-Doo Night of 100 Frights was developed by Heavy Iron Studios, the same team behind the beloved SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom game, which came out a year after this. So hopefully, we're going to be in good hands here. The game begins with this awesome recreation of the original opening of Scooby-Doo Where Are You?, only instead of classic 2D animation, it uses the in-game models to recreate it. It's an awesome detail and it makes the game feel like a proper episode of the show. The main menu is pretty awesome too, with you seeing the inside of the mystery machine and getting a look at all of the different computer screens and gadgets in there by flicking through the options. There's even a promotional video for a Hot Wheels game here, which is a bit random, but I love stuff like this. This Hot Wheels game actually looks really cool too, and the trailer is really intense for no reason. After all of that intensity, I think it's about time that we start the actual game. So, let's have a look at the plot setup. We start the game with an opening cutscene showing the Mystery Inc. gang all rendered in full 3D. It actually looks pretty good for an early PS2 game, and the plot here is basically exactly the same as what we'd normally get in the TV show. The gang have been called to investigate some spooky goings-on at a nearby mansion, which is the home of Professor Alexander Graham and Holly Graham, who happens to be Daphne's old friend from back in the day. Scooby and Shaggy are as reluctant as ever, but the gang split up to search the area for any clues, leaving the pair of them alone. Shaggy accidentally activates a trapdoor, which leaves Scooby all alone, and that's where the game begins. Now, the game itself is actually really interesting because you would probably assume that this was going to be a fairly straightforward 3D platformer, being quite linear and maybe just having you progress through levels like you would in something like Crash Bandicoot. However, it's actually not structured like that at all. The world here is presented as one seamless area, split into multiple sub-areas. Entering these sub-areas activates a loading screen, of course, but you get the impression that everything is linked together and makes geographical sense. You start the game outside of the Mystic Manor, and from there you already have 4 different routes to take. You can go to a tutorial area to get used to the controls and find a few collectibles. You can go inside the mansion itself. You can go to a little fishing village, or you can head into the mansion gardens. Despite this feeling maybe a little bit overwhelming, I found that for the most part there is only ever one intended route forward at any one time, and you're stopped from taking a wrong direction by getting roadblocked by an obstacle that you can't get around without a certain item. So this can be something like a steep slope requiring a plunger item to stop you from slipping, or an umbrella item which allows you to float over large gaps. In this way, the game is actually structured like a 3D Metroidvania, which I definitely wasn't expecting. It even has a map system to stop you from getting lost, and these teleportation devices allow you to quickly zip around to previous areas too. Later on in the game, it can be a little bit difficult to work out exactly where you need to go though. Often you'll require one or maybe even multiple gadgets that you don't actually have access to yet, and you might have no idea where to go to get them. There was a while of playing this where I actually got stuck for a fairly significant amount of time because it wasn't obvious where I had to go, and I think this element of the game could have potentially been improved. Like here, there's this section where there's actually two different ways that you can go forward. One of them is just on the path that you can actually see where you have to jump down, but then there's this other route where there's a platform that you have to jump to, but it's a complete leap of faith, with you not being able to see that there's anything even there for you to go to. There's also this, which is a slightly different situation, but this sort of thing happened to me quite a few times. So here, there's this wall that you have to bash through in order to get into a secret room and get a key. But the issue is that when Scooby is using the sponge gadget to stop him from slipping around on different surfaces, he actually can't attack while moving. This led to me thinking that this wall opened by finding a switch somewhere else, and I ended up wasting so much time exploring the entire mansion looking for a switch that doesn't even exist. It turns out that all you need to do is stand in a really specific spot and then press the attack button, which will send him through the wall. There are other examples of clunky stuff happening like this as well, but this is by far the worst example. To help with all of this, I feel like maybe the gadgets and certain key items should have all been marked on the map, so you had a basic idea of where you needed to go once you came up to a certain obstacle. Maybe in order to get them to appear on the map, you could have found clues which told you where certain items were. This would have fit in with the whole Scooby-Doo theming after all. Speaking of collectibles though, obviously the main gameplay altering items are the gadgets, some changing your moveset by giving you brand new abilities like a helmet to headbutt enemies, spring shoes to double jump, or an umbrella to float, but some are more context sensitive, like the plunger which allows you to walk up steep slopes, or the super smash which allows you to press buttons which are placed on the floor. There's a constant feeling of progression through these power-ups, and because some of them are useful for combat or maneuverability, as well as allowing you to access places you couldn't before, it always feels like a significant upgrade whenever you find anything. Some of the other collectibles you'll be coming across are the Scooby snacks, which act as the primary collectible in the game, and you'll be finding these everywhere, and these basically act as a guide to show you where to go, and also act as a marker for you to be able to instantly tell if you've been to a certain location or not. The main purpose of these though is that they unlock these Scooby snack gates, which will block you off from entering certain areas if you don't have enough. So basically, you need to pay a toll before you can get in, and because of this, it's always for the best that you're collecting all of the snacks that you see. The main optional collectibles are these monster tokens, and these will be hidden in most areas of the game. When you collect one of these, you can enter a secret area of the mansion called the Monster Gallery, and you can view a bio of the monster whose token you've collected. They have a full 3D model, some trivia, and some information about what episode they're from and stuff. It's actually really cool, and it made me want to find as many of these as possible. The Monster Gallery is also home to this machine where you can look at some notes on the game's development, looking at early artwork and pre-release renders of certain areas, and stuff like that. To unlock these though, you need to completely clear an area of the game of all of the Scooby snacks and monster tokens. Despite this game quite clearly being a kid-friendly 3D platformer, something that I did find quite interesting is that the developers of the game seem to have taken a look at the whole spooky vibe of Scooby-Doo and decided to take small amounts of inspiration from survival horror games. Obviously, I'm not talking about violence or gore or anything like that, but they do seem to have taken a small amount of inspiration from stuff like Resident Evil. The most obvious thing being the fact that the game unusually takes place from set camera angles. You have no control over the camera at all, and rather it'll just automatically follow Scooby, or just cut to different angles entirely in certain situations, exactly like the camera works in Silent Hill. Of course, you also have the Metroidvania elements that we've already mentioned, something which was also a staple of classic survival horror games, with you needing to find key items and backtrack to earlier areas to progress. You even start the game completely unable to defend yourself, something which is also used in a lot of horror games to evoke a sense of vulnerability, forcing you to avoid enemies rather than facing them head on. There's also some smaller details, like the fact that certain doors will be locked from the other side, something which is straight up taken from Resident Evil. And I'm fairly sure that there's no way all of this could have been a coincidence. The developers must have known what they were doing with all of this, and they basically ended up making a kid-friendly survival horror game combined with a 3D platformer, and it actually works. I love games that are like this, and it's a shame that there's not very many examples of them, with the only other ones I can think of being Luigi's Mansion and Little Nightmares. We need more of these kid-friendly horror games. Because of the changing camera angles, certain parts of the game will take place from a 2D perspective, and others take place in 3D space. In this way, it's sort of similar to Crash Bandicoot, which also shifted perspectives like this. But it doesn't feel at all like a Crash rip-off because of how different it is structurally. This adds quite a bit of variety, but in general, I would probably say that the lack of variety is one of the worst things about this whole game. Although, having said that this isn't a Crash Bandicoot rip-off, there was this section of the game where you're being chased by water that looked suspiciously familiar. After a while, when the uniqueness of the game's structure wears off, you'll find that actually the core gameplay here is maybe a bit shallow. You run around collecting stuff and try to find areas you've not been to yet, but everything around that is quite tedious. The platform in itself is extremely basic, just consisting of jumping over holes every now and then. And despite your moveset expanding with stuff like getting a double jump and the ability to float, it doesn't actually change all that much, apart from the holes you're jumping over get a bit bigger. There are some infrequent standout sections though, like this bit where water is slowly filling a room and you have to jump on boats to reach higher up ledges before the boat sinks under your weight. And there's this bit with these moving blocks which you have to jump on to make your way to the top of a platform. But for the vast majority of the game, there's just nothing going on with the level design or your moveset to make this particularly interesting. The platforming heavy sections can actually become quite frustrating at times, mostly in the areas which feature water, because rather than falling into water and it resetting you on the platform you were just on, or taking away a hit point and allowing you to jump out of the water yourself, the game acts like you've fully died and it resets you at the start of the area you're on. Some of these areas are pretty huge as well, and if you're trying to get all of the Scooby snacks, you'll often find yourself doing some risky maneuvers to reach them, which obviously often ends up with falling in the water. Plus, on top of all of this, because the camera is at a fixed perspective, it can be very difficult to judge depth properly, and you can straight up misjudge jumps because of it. Normally this isn't an issue, but in specific areas like this one, it's unbelievably annoying. This was probably the single worst part of the whole game for me. In fact, if you do play this game for yourself, I would highly recommend that you don't try to get every single Scooby snack, because there's a lot of instances where I swear that the hitboxes just don't work properly. Like look, surely I'm hitting this Scooby snack. This looks like I'm right on top of it for God's sake. Why couldn't they make the snacks magnetized to you very slightly, considering how difficult it is to see depth because of the camera? That would have completely fixed this issue. The combat is very similar in the way that it's quite tedious. There's actually a lot of visual variety with the enemy designs, but the way that they actually function is always the same. Some will just try and walk into you to hit you, some will try and throw something at you from a distance, and yeah, that's it. Now this wouldn't be too bad if there was some other layers of complexity, but no. They're all just defeated by either headbutting them or ground pounding them. There's no enemies that are immune to a certain type of attack either. Just do either of your attacks and it'll work every time. Why wasn't there some enemies wearing helmets that stopped you from ground pounding them, or enemies with armor where you couldn't headbutt them? That would have at least have been something. Sure, some of the enemies take 2 hits to beat, but big deal, it's still functionally the same as hitting them one time. And to the game's credit, I suppose there are these ghost enemies that you actually can't hit at all, but it's so easy to just jump around them or run past them that they're hardly even worth bringing up. What makes this worse is that there's a sliver of an idea here that could have made encountering enemies more interesting, and that's this mechanic where you can put slippers on and sneak past enemies, or put on a disguise and hide. Basically, it's a rudimentary stealth mechanic, allowing you to slowly slip past enemies without them running at you. But because of how easy the enemies are to just defeat or simply run past, I hardly ever used this mechanic. Why wasn't there an enemy that couldn't be defeated and you had to sneak past them or something? It's such an underbaked concept, which is annoying considering that the combat that we do have is also incredibly underbaked as well. Now, saying that there's literally no variety at all is a bit misleading, because there are these short sequences where you meet up with Shaggy again, and the two of you work together to solve a puzzle or a platforming challenge. These sections are actually quite good, and all of them are fairly unique too, like this one where Shaggy is inside a barrel and you need to call him over to you with him being unable to see. Then you get him to stand on a switch to open a gate, thus allowing you to move ahead. The problem here is that while this is a good concept, it's only used a single time and there's not really any obstacles. It's like they introduce concepts where you're thinking, okay, this is going to get expanded later on and throw in more of a challenge. Like, maybe you have to guide Shaggy across a narrow path, or you need to time his movements to get past enemies or swing in obstacles or something. But no, it's just used this one time in what feels like a tutorial section, and then that's it. Never seen again. It's really disappointing. But okay, we didn't come into this game expecting a masterpiece or anything, did we? So let's stop talking about the bad things about the game and have a look at some of the things that it actually does quite well. One thing I do want to mention is that the graphics here are actually really good. There's quite a bit of visual variety with the areas you explore, from the gardens, the main mansion and the fishing areas, which all look quite distinct. But other than that, each area feels quite dynamic and interesting with little background details, like these moving pictures, curtains blowing in the wind, moving water effects, and loads of things like that. Going from the PS1 era up to this was just mind-blowing at the time. The jump between those two generations is probably the biggest that we've ever had, and this is really a good example of that jump in graphical fidelity. There's even some chained up skeletons found in this dungeon area, and we all know I love a good video game skeleton. But wait, doesn't that kind of imply that somebody's been chained up here and tortured, or at the very least starved to death? Have Mystery Inc. actually been called in to investigate a murder scene without even realising it? Let's hope that we find Fred, Daphne, Velma and Shaggy before they're subjected to the Iron Maiden. Another thing which is actually really good about Night of 100 Frights is that they clearly wanted to make it very authentic to the original TV show. Not only with things like only including the original cast members and removing people like Scrappy-Doo, but also the plot setup being so reminiscent of the show, the fact that to get health back you eat a variety of food collectibles, the voice acting which is extremely on point. In fact, it uses the same voice actors from different iterations of the animation, with Scott Ines voicing Shaggy and Scooby, the same actor who provided the voice from the 1998 to the 2001 movies, Gray Delisle voicing Daphne, who is actually the current voice of the character, BJ Ward as Velma, who also did the voice back in the 1998 to 2001 movies, and finally Frank Welker as Fred, who has actually voiced the character in practically every single rendition of the show, which is pretty impressive. Other than that, one of the strangest ways in which the game feels in line with the original show is that it actually features a laugh track. And this isn't just in the cutscenes, but also in the gameplay too. So whenever Scooby does anything kinda wacky, like putting on a disguise or swinging from a chandelier or something, the unseen audience will laugh, making it feel like it's a show being made in front of a studio audience. Just like with the cartoon. I loved this detail, and luckily it doesn't happen so frequently that it becomes annoying. They got this just right. Something else I liked, which actually feels a little bit ahead of its time, is that there's no life system in the game, and instead you simply have infinite continues, which actually works really well for a game like this. Having lives serves basically no purpose here, and would have just have required you to restart from an earlier point if you got a game over, and made the experience even more frustrating. So I think this was a very wise decision, and not that many platformers did this back then, so hats off to the developers there. Even though the standard enemies might lack mechanical complexity though, there are of course the bosses that we have to talk about. Before we get to that though, we should probably talk about why all of these monsters are roaming the mansion and its grounds in the first place. Basically, the main bad guy here is called the Mastermind, and in order to stop Mystery Inc. from investigating his hideout, he's somehow revived all of the past villains that the gang have stopped before, only this time they appear to be real rather than people in costumes. The bosses featured in this game are some of the most standout villains from the TV show. So we have the Black Knight, we have the Green Ghost, and finally, the Ghost of Redbeard. All of these bosses actually play out completely differently, and all of them have pretty interesting concepts. The Black Knight is defeated by pressing buttons just as he walks above them on a platform, which then delivers an electric shock to him. Meanwhile though, he's also throwing projectiles at you and spawning enemies, so you're having to multitask by paying attention to where he is, while also dealing with his attacks and his minions. The Green Ghost is probably the worst boss in the game, because not only are you reliant on the ghost itself being above one of 3 coffins, but you're also having to rely on Daphne to be in the right place to open that particular coffin as well. Then, once the stars align and the ghost is above an open coffin, you can hit a switch which activates a trap and deals damage to the ghost. The issue though is that for some reason, sometimes even when things are in the perfect positions, the trap just won't deal any damage, and it took forever to actually beat this boss. It's a reasonably good concept, but just poorly executed. Then with Redbeard, this is a more straightforward boss in the way that you're not really relying on anything random, and rather all you need to do is defeat his minions and wait for him to attack, but then hide behind one of 4 ropes in the corners of the arena and his attack will cut a rope. When all 4 of these are cut, he gets crushed under a treasure chest and the boss is done. The best thing about these bosses though is the music, and that's not because it's insanely epic or anything like that. Oh no, it's because they feature vocals, and one of them is even this ridiculous cover of Hey Hey with the Monkeys, but with the lyrics swapped to be about the Black Knight coming for you and telling Scooby to watch out. To be honest, I kind of wish that there was more goofy stuff like this happening in the game, because this is one of the standout parts of the entire experience.
Watch out, Scooby, Black Knight's coming for you. Better not be too slow down, wind up with Velma too.
Of course, there is a 4th and final boss fight against the Mastermind himself, and this is actually one of the better fights too, actually having 2 different phases, which makes it feel quite climactic. In the first phase, you need to defeat enemies while waiting for an electric barrier protecting 2 switches to turn off. Then, after hitting both of these, the rest of the gang sneak up behind the Mastermind and scare him down to your level. This is where a more direct fight takes place, in which you need to ground pound him to stun him and then headbutt him to move him over to the electric barriers from before, electrocuting him and ending the game. This, by the way, is the only enemy in the entire game which actually requires the use of both of your forms of attack. So why couldn't they have done something like this for the other enemies too? Either way, letting that go, it's a decent fight to end the game and actually offers a bit of complexity, which is nice. I guess I should warn you that there's spoilers ahead here, so skip to the time on the screen now if you want to avoid any plot details for a 2-decade-old Scooby-Doo game for some reason. So after beating the mastermind, he's sucked up through a tube and spat out at the entrance of the mansion. The gang all rush over and unmask him, only to discover that it was Professor Graham all along. This is the guy that's invented all of the contraptions that you've been using throughout the game. But he's hardly ever actually made any appearances. The gang realise that something's fishy about this though, and discover a secret wall where Holly is hiding, controlling a bunch of holograms. It turns out that all of the monsters you've fought throughout the game have been nothing but holograms, which makes no sense seeing as they can attack you, but we'll ignore that. And the version of Holly that you've been bumping into throughout the whole game has been nothing more than a hologram, with the real Holly hiding in this secret room for the entire time. She was hoping to get the professor arrested and steal all of his inventions, thus becoming rich. And she would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you meddling kids. Overall, this is a pretty good ending, and even though it was fairly obvious who the bad guy was gonna be, the little fake out at the end was interesting, and I initially was actually a little bit surprised before it revealed the true perpetrator. But the best thing about finishing this is the credits, and that's because, like all good games, we end things off with some unnecessary rave music. Let's go.
Now it's time to get to the bottom of this mystery.
We're not afraid, right,
But there we have it. Would I recommend Scooby-Doo Night of 100 Frights? Well, no, not really. While it's structured in an interesting way and combines a 3D platformer with a Metroidvania, which was extremely unique at the time, this is really the only thing that particularly stands out about the experience, and everything around that, like the platforming, level design and combat, is quite boring and tedious. Not to mention that because of the maze-like level design that's reliant on backtracking, you'll probably end up getting lost at some point, which only adds to how annoying the game can be. There are smaller details to like here though, like the graphics and the attention to detail with the visuals, the feeling of authenticity with the TV show, and the awesome rewards for collecting things through the monster bios and the behind the scenes documents. But really, the gameplay itself is just a little bit below par for me. It's not that it's a bad game by any means, but it's also nothing special and just kind of ends up being a little bit mediocre. So, that's Scooby-Doo Night of 100 Frights. A bit of a rough beginning for the Scooby-Doo-a-Thon, but at least there's nowhere to go but up from here. At least, I hope. So, join me next week where we'll be taking a look at the second Scooby-Doo game released on the PS2 with Scooby-Doo Mystery Mayhem. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, subscribe to see my video coming out on Mystery Mayhem next week, and leave a comment down below letting me know what you thought to Night of 100 Frights. And, until that video, bye!